So welcome to Rails Trails Conservancy's webinar. I'm Kevin Mills, the Vice President of Policy, and with me today are Patrick Woyan, our Director of Government Relations, and Marianne Fowler, our Senior Policy Strategist. And early this morning, well, first let me say, most of this time will be reserved for your questions and our answers to those. And anytime during this webinar, you're welcome to drop your questions into the Dropbox on your screen. But early this morning, about 5 a.m., after a 19-hour markup, the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure passed a largely partisan vote on the Invest in America Act of 2021, or the INVEST Act. They did get a couple of the Republicans on the committee to vote for the bill, and it passed. It was a $547 billion 5-year investment in transportation. And the committee has written what is a transformative bill, the likes of which we really haven't seen in a generation. For the first time in federal law, the bill recognizes active transportation as mainstream mobility that requires dedicated investments to create, connect, and maintain these vital community assets. Active transportation suffused throughout the bill to an unprecedented degree, with the overarching goals of the bill, such as safety, climate, and equitable access to jobs and essential services, driving reforms in planning, policy, and programs that will provide numerous opportunities for trails, walking, and biking to contribute. Let me start with the dedicated funding. So Rails Trails Conservancy has prioritized passage of a trio of bills relating to dedicated funding for trails, walking, and biking. We seek to grow and improve the delivery of two long existing 30-year-old programs, Transportation Alternatives and the Recreational Trails Program, and then supplement those with a new program that provides much larger grants that are focused on connectivity of trails, sidewalks, and bike lanes. And so those existing core programs will gain new vitality with this bill, while the latter, the new program, is called Active Transportation Connectivity Grants in the bill. And we see this as the next essential step in active transportation policy. So we see three critical needs being addressed by these dedicated funding provisions. The first is that we double the dedicated funding for active transportation and for recreation. The total dedicated funding between these three programs is $1.75 billion, while under current law, it's $850 million, right? So we had gone into this process looking to at least double that current funding, and this is achieved under the House bill. So the Transportation Alternatives and Recreational Trails Program each grow by 75% under this bill, and then the Active Transportation Connectivity Grants will add another $250 million per year. Then the second thing is that we add focused funding. So not only is there more money, but we're delivering it in more strategic ways. So, and our movement has really matured, where we see communities all across the country really pulling together and seeing the need to weave together their existing facilities into seamless ways, low stress routes to get where people are going within and between communities. And so that is why we believe that this new program is so critical, because it provides more sizable grants that's going to provide that connectivity people need to take active transportation to the next level. Now, in the bill, they provide, as I said, $250 million for this. It would come from the Highway Trust Fund, so it wouldn't be subject to year-in, year-out appropriations. And this commitment will go far to begin to address pent-up demand for these kinds of facilities. We did the Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act, which set up the creation of this program. The request was for $500 million per year. Obviously, we would rather see that level of funding. However, at this step of reauthorization, the most important thing is to establish the program at a scope where we can show its success. And we see many other short and long-term opportunities to increase the funding level for it. And then the third thing about dedicated funding is that its integrity is protected by the policies in this bill. And most notable in that regard is that transfers of transportation alternatives funds have become a major problem, with many states transferring away a lot of their funding to other purposes beyond the intended eligibilities for transportation alternatives. And We've documented this recently with a report, and this bill, we're glad to say, would take steps to ensure that states have had good faith competitive processes that they've run before they could even consider transferring those funds. And so that's an important policy improvement. Second thing, the overall transportation reforms of this bill are just as critical as the dedicated funding, in that they're creating goals and accountability to those goals that are really going to change the policy landscape for transportation. So, so they have, their goals are things like climate change, where they recognize that transportation is the top source of CO2 emissions in the country, and we need to for transportation to make a contribution to solving that problem, not just being the worst source of the problem. And taking steps to reduce reliance on driving is part of that. Safety, pedestrian and bike fatalities have relentlessly risen for over a decade. This bill rethinks policies in a number of ways to reverse this trend. Access. So our transportation system really needs to enable all Americans to get the places they need to go, to jobs, to essential services, regardless of whether they drive. The transportation policy can no longer be only about how we move cars through a space more quickly. And so this policy has transportation plans demonstrating that they've really improved access to these jobs and essential services and other key destinations. And then equity also moves to the forefront, recognizing that transportation policy has divided Americans more than it's united them. And we need more equitable decision-making going forward, and we need mitigating measures to deal with past injustices. So all of these key goals have accountability and policy changes associated with them, and it recognizes that active transportation has an essential role to play in delivering on these goals. So we see that as being very transformative if those kinds of provisions get to the finish line. Next piece is there's huge focus in here on safety, and in particular on recognizing that pedestrian and bicycle safety is where the trends have been going in the wrong direction, and far more needs to be done. So the term vulnerable road user is used liberally throughout the bill, and it takes a safe systems approach in which human error is acknowledged and fatalities are treated as really preventable. So Vision Zero plans are required to significantly reduce or eliminate serious injuries and fatalities in no less than 20 years. And active transportation connectivity is recognized as a valuable aspect of complete streets prioritization plans. The next piece I want to note is that trails, walking, and biking are eligible for many programs, existing and new. And because of the way the bill is structured, active transportation will be more competitive in trying to access those funds, right? So we've long been eligible for programs like the Surface Transportation Block Grants, but active transportation is rarely prioritized or selected for those projects. But through the goal setting, the performance standards, and other reforms, the INVEST Act provides reasons to be optimistic that active transportation can rise to the top of these things. And I want to note 3 of the new programs for which this is particularly so, because embedded in the goals themselves are opportunities for trails, walking, and biking. So there's a new carbon reduction program for states to fund greenhouse gas reductions with incentives for the best performing states and disincentives for the least. There's a gridlock reduction grant program for large metro areas that explicitly include multimodal solutions. And there's a new $3 billion discretionary grant program to reconnect neighborhoods that were divided by transportation projects. And so all of those we think will provide rich new opportunities where active transportation can make a significant contribution. The last thing I want to note before we go to our questions and answers is member designated projects. That's the polite phrase to mean earmarks. And what the House has brought back earmarks as part of the reauthorization process for the first time since Safety Lou passed in 2005. They were phased out a little bit later than that, but not in a reauthorization context since then. And this bill establishes fiscal 2022 as a transition year in which we will largely have the current transportation policies, but they'll be putting on top of that over $5.6 billion in these member designated projects. In terms of these earmarks in the bill, a large component of them address trails, walking, and biking, and many of those demonstrate strong demand for enhanced connectivity of low-stress walking and biking networks. We did an actual accounting and analysis of the earmarks, both the requests and the approvals in the bill. We see over $1 billion of projects included in the bill that at least have an active transportation component. That's 23% of the projects and over 18% of the money. About over 16% of the projects and over 11% of the funds went to projects that were solely about active transportation, and many of those were about trail connectivity. So we see in that a very clear signal of all this pent-up demand for trails, walking, and biking generally, but especially for connectivity, and that's why having many of the advocates around the country taken advantage of this earmarking opportunity to get their ideas in front of their member of Congress has panned out to their advantage. And we also see in that the importance of this call for the connectivity program that will allow us to sustain building of all those connections over time. So with that, I want to pivot to your questions. Please keep your questions coming into the Q&A box. All right, let me start with a question. This is a question about how local advocates what could they be doing to increase the likelihood of these connectivity grants becoming part of the final bill? What are some things that local allies can do to help as we go forward? Either one of you may address that.
Sure, I'll start. I think just by collecting, I know all of you are probably working on your own projects locally, and those projects are critical for your members of Congress, your senators, and members of the House of Representatives to be aware of and to understand the benefits that they will bring to your communities, and also to understand the investment that's needed to make them happen. How these programs that are in this bill, how this increased investment could benefit your communities. That's really critical for us to get across. Oftentimes, members of Congress can write off active transportation infrastructure and say it's not really truly part of infrastructure. It's not a key part of our critical national infrastructure. So getting across the point to them that it is critical, that it's critical to your community, and that federal investment is really important to make it happen. And then also just keeping an eye on the emails that you receive from us, so that you know when you can chime in, and when it's important for you to weigh in with your members to make sure that they understand your support, are aware of your support for this investment.
Great. So Marianne, what do you see as the likelihood of passage? Both House versus Senate, as well as kind of the timetable for all this to happen. I believe you're muted, Marianne.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
I'm a little weary because I made it till 4:30 this morning, and then I just nodded off. I missed the grand finale. So I'm a combination of weary and euphoric, because this really is such an extraordinary bill. So this was on the House side and the Senate side. We both now passed key committees, and each body will move to the floor. I don't think we have any problem on the floor on the House side, because I think that the Democratic majority will hold. And I think that some more Republicans probably than voted for the bill in committee will vote for it on the House floor. One of the notable differences in the markup this year compared to all the others we've been through is that at no point was walking and biking, active transportation, challenged as a part of the transportation system. It was a sort of taken for granted that we are now a recognized mobility option. So that is just really good news, and that's one of the reasons why I think we won't have a problem on the House floor. The Senate side is somewhat different. The vote on our connectivity grants on the Senate side we prevailed by only one vote. That's because we had a bipartisan support from Senator Sullivan from Alaska. We have 2 Republican senators as co-sponsors, again, from Alaska, Senator Murkowski. So I think there may, unless we all collectively are able to communicate to our senators, particularly our Republican senators, that we don't want the connectivity program or any of our programs messed with on the Senate floor, we could face an effort to strip, particularly the connectivity votes. So I think that's our danger point. Our real danger point is in a Senate floor vote. And so if you have a senator that is on the T&I committee, or excuse me, the EPW committee, particularly if you have a Republican senator, that's who you need to be in touch with.
And
like vote often, and anyway, you need to be in touch with them often, not just one-off, but sort of keep in touch as we move toward this vote, which is likely to be before the 4th of July.
all right, thank you. So actually, Marianne, I'll stay with you as we have a question about maintenance. Want to know whether there are provisions in the bill that will help us with rehabilitation and repair of trails and other active transportation infrastructure. Can you
Well,
help us with
the
that?
recreational trails program does have, and when you look at its permissible uses under the law, the first 3 permissible uses relate to maintenance. So that's quite important. And that maintenance can be performed on a trail that was not originally funded with rec trail dollars. So keep that in mind too. It's going to be really interesting to see, and this is probably an issue for us to work with in guidance as we look at the funding that's available for resilience, that we need to think of resilience and maintenance of our trails sort of in the same way, that as we make our system overall more resilient, that has to do with the resiliency of trails too, which is related to maintenance of trails. Now, we're not talking about the everyday maintenance of cutting of grass and things like that. Congress has made it very clear those are local responsibilities, but sort of mega maintenance of keeping surfaces and restoring surfaces as they age out and things like that, or if a bridge erodes out, that is the kind of maintenance that I think resilience could help us fund.
Yeah, climate resiliency is another theme in the bill, and it would also relate to the initial design of facilities. If you built a trail to deal with floodwaters, for instance, that would be an advantage and might even make it eligible for additional funds. So a related question, are there provisions specific to rural areas? Both of you may have thoughts on that. Anyone you want to start, Patrick?
I'll note that the Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act includes a requirement that 30% be spent on what are called connectors. And their definition, well, connectors we initially called them spines. Connectors was a language that they changed that to, but that's basically a trail that connects between 2 communities. So the focus there is really more on sort of on more rural trails that might connect between the distance between two small towns, 2 communities. If you think about like our Great American Rail Trail connecting communities across the country, so that's one way that we wanted to target some funding specifically to rural communities. There's also a number of the different programs have rural set-asides. In fact, one of the amendments that passed last night was the carbon reduction program that Kevin mentioned has a 10% set aside now for rural communities, for carbon reduction in rural communities. That was an amendment that passed. So, which I think is a great opportunity for trails because we often just grow a lot of great opportunities for trails in rural communities, and I think some real opportunity to explore how that can be used to help address carbon emissions in rural areas. So that's a couple of examples of specific funding for rural communities.
There was also an interesting amendment that was accepted from Congressman Larson that is last night that's defining rural as areas outside of population centers that are 70,000 and above, I think. So it's making it clearer that what a rural area is so that their eligibility to apply for funding under these various new rural options is clearer, I think. So for a variety of reasons, there was a real effort on the part of the in the drafting of this bill to make it rural applicable.
Yes. And so I see a question here. I'll just provide these numbers, which is looking for clarification about how much the different dedicated programs would get under this bill. And so there's 1.5, an average over the life of the bill of 1.5 billion to the combination of transportation alternatives and recreational trails, with recreational trails getting 147 million of that, and transportation alternatives being just over 1.35 billion per year, each per year, and then 250 million per year for the new connectivity grants. So just clarifying that. Next question is about how reauthorization may relate to the infrastructure negotiations we've heard so much about at the White House.
Well, I'll start on that one. You know, President Biden, in one of his press conferences last week, made it very clear that the money he's talking about for infrastructure in his stimulus bill is over and above the money that will be included in this transportation reauthorization bill. He's not letting the happenstance of these two things occurring at the same time dictate a pattern where the money that would have been reauthorized for transportation anyway gets counted toward the stimulus bill. He has said, no, this stimulus money is going to be in addition to that. And part of what we see going on here, I think, is that the House and Senate planned to finish the reauthorization process in time to have established the policy network and the baseline funding in the transportation bill, so that the stimulus bill can layer funding in on top of that. So I think that's the grand plan. Whether that works out or not, we don't know for sure. It's up to us. Patrick, do you have any thoughts? Any further?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to have to be some passage of because there's so much policy in the surface transportation reauthorization bill. It needs to be passed on a bipartisan basis. The reconciliation is the process where that doesn't require 60 votes in the Senate, so that doesn't necessarily have to be done in a bipartisan way, and that is likely where the additional investment is going to come. That's really likely to be the stimulus, unless they can find a way to get bipartisan agreement on that, which is looking less and less likely, I think. But that stimulus piece of it will more likely be done by reconciliation, I think.
Well, and Mr. DeFazio made an interesting statement this morning at 4 o'clock that he was determined to get his policy into his House bill, and that in going into conference, that if he has to give some on the money, he would rather do that than lose any of his policy, because he can add money through the stimulus process.
So that's a little bit of a segue to the next question, which relates to this took background knowledge we didn't cover in the opening comments, but it is true that the House bill uses the Highway Trust Fund for the connectivity grants, and the Senate was relying on the general fund. They both chambers included connectivity grants in their bills, but from a different funding source. Could you explain, Patrick? Why don't you give it to you to explain what is the significance of that difference?
Sure. Well, the biggest significance for us is that when funds are authorized to be taken from the general fund, it's a two-step process. It relies first on authorization of the spending of the funds, and then they have to be appropriated into the program. So under the Senate version of the bill, we get halfway there. We get the authorization of the funds, but it's not yet appropriated. So that would require us, if that is the version that ultimately becomes law, it requires us to go through the appropriations process to fight for those funds to be appropriated into the program. For funds that come from the Highway Trust Fund, that's a one-step process. It's automatically as part of the bill, it automatically is taken from the Highway Trust Fund and put into that program. So that's the biggest distinction for us, is that we'll be coming back to you for support if the Senate version becomes law, so that we can get it appropriated.
So one of the people writing in the box had made a comment about how they had particular needs in their community for pretty comprehensive upgrading of facilities that they already have, that there's increased demand because of micromobility and some things like that. And that they basically just have these great capital needs, and some of it's about new connections, but some of it's also about the way demand is testing what they are, the limits of what they already have. Have any thoughts about, will this bill, help communities that are in situations like that?
Probably depends upon how we're able to affect the writing of the guidance, which is another step in this whole process. As I'm sure everybody knows, that Congress passes the law, and then the interpretation of that law is another step process, which is done by the administration. And in answering or thinking about that question, it occurs to me that when we are working with the administration on setting out what the guidance is going to be, that we need to include such situations in our guidance for the connectivity grants, because the connectivity grants are about the entire system. They aren't about just one part of the system. So if the system needs upgrading as well as connecting, then that should be included in, and thank you for that question, because that we'll make a note and make sure that we press that point during the guidance process. I'm not as confident about how we can affect the funding from the other programs. We know about the RIC trails. We probably need to look at transportation enhancements and see for sort of one-off projects whether upgrading, how we can make that eligible also. Because let's face it, we funneled 30 years of funding, and there was more funding than just the federal funding, but certainly 30 years of funding into building bike ped trail facilities. And they, like any other infrastructure facility, begin to age out. We think of ourselves as the new kids on the block, and that our stuff is the new stuff, but some of our stuff is getting pretty old. As are some of our people. So,
yeah, thank you. And so similarly, in a region, connectivity grants could be the solution to that situation. What about, the last question will be from the audience, is about multi-state trails, whether it's the Great American Rail Trail all across the country, or the East Coast Greenway up and down the East Coast. Are these changes going to help us build across state lines like that?
Patrick?
Yeah, certainly, definitely. The Connecting America's Active Transportation System Act envisions building trails across state lines. It's complicated, but there's flexibility there. Who can apply for the funds to make it happen? So groups of governments, coalitions, consortiums of governments can work on that. Definitely.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And we're in the last seconds here, so I will thank our folks for coming to our webinar and for sending us such great questions, and for your ongoing interest in these important changes. And we're really excited about what we've seen in this bill, and we look forward to continuing to work with you as we go through the additional steps in this process to bring it to the finish line. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.